November 14, 1942. The strait between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, the stretch of water American sailors already call Ironbottom Sound. On the SG radar screen aboard the battleship USS Washington, green dots are vanishing. Walkie is first. A long-lance torpedo, 30 feet of oxygen-powered steel running without a wake at 48 knots, breaks the destroyer in half. Her depth charges detonate a minute later, killing men who survived the sinking and are now floating in the dark. Preston takes shells and a torpedo simultaneously. Her aft magazine detonates. Benham loses her bow. Gwynn takes shell hits and falls out of the fight. 10 minutes. The entire destroyer screen is gone. The second battleship, South Dakota, 35,000 tons, loses all electrical power when a single circuit breaker trips and takes radar, fire control, and communications with it. She goes blind.
When power comes back and her guns fire, the muzzle blast ignites her own scout planes on their catapults. Flames climb the superstructure. A searchlight from the heavy cruiser Otago finds her, and every Japanese ship in the strait opens fire at once. 14-inch shells from the battleship Kirishima. 8-inch salvos from Otago and Takao. Nearly 30 hits. 38 men killed, 60 wounded. South Dakota's belt armor holds, because Kirishima's Type 3 shells were designed for airfield buildings, not for cracking open a battleship. They destroy everything above the waterline. They cannot sink her. South Dakota turns south and runs. USS Washington is the last American warship still fighting in Ironbottom Sound. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Willis Lee has been watching the SG radar for 20 minutes. A large return on the starboard beam is tracking with the Japanese formation. His gun crews are loaded. His fire control team has a solution. He is not firing.
7 minutes of shooting will decide the outcome of this night and the fate of Guadalcanal. The shells that will do the most damage, Lee will record as misses. The answer to why a man with 9 16-inch guns aimed and ready waits 20 minutes in the dark begins 22 years before this night on a rifle range in Antwerp. In 1920, Lieutenant Willis Augustus Lee, Jr. traveled to Antwerp, Belgium, as a member of the United States Navy rifle team for the Olympic Games. He competed in 14 shooting events and came home with 7 medals: 5 gold, 1 silver, 1 bronze. He was the most decorated athlete of the 1920 Olympics. His record for most medals won at a single games stood for 60 years. 13 years before Antwerp, as a midshipman at Annapolis, Lee became the only person to win both the National Rifle Championship and the National Pistol Championship in the same year, 1907. He was 19 years old. His classmates at the academy included future admirals Thomas Kincaid and Arthur Carpenter. But Lee's distinction was different from theirs. He did not care about protocol. He did not care about ceremony. He cared about where the bullet went. The nickname Ching came from the academy, where his surname and his fondness for the Far East made the connection inevitable. He kept it. In 1942, his combat radio call sign was Ching Chong China Lee, and he used it without hesitation. He chain-smoked Philip Morris cigarettes on the bridge, kept a stack of pulp novels within reach, and wore his rank lightly around younger officers. Underneath this was a mind built for gunnery. Before the war, Lee served as director of fleet training, and in that role, he did something that no other flag officer thought necessary. He insisted that civilian scientists be embedded in his division to work directly on the operational problems of integrating radar with fire control systems. While every other commander in the fleet treated radar as a backup for poor visibility, something to fall back on when fog or rain obscured the horizon, Lee treated it as the primary weapon. He ran drills in full darkness, in heavy seas, in smoke, in rain, until his fire control teams could trust the green dot on the screen more than their own eyes, and put a shell exactly where the radar told them to. This was the decision that would break the Japanese night-fighting doctrine. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what that doctrine was built on and why it had worked for 18 months without failing. The Imperial Japanese Navy invested 2 decades in night combat. The foundation was arithmetic. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited Japan to 3 capital ships for every 5 the United States could build. Japan's fleet was structurally smaller. The answer was a doctrine of decisive night engagement, where the quality of trained crews would overcome the enemy's numerical advantage. This required 3 things: a weapon that killed in the dark, eyes that saw in the dark, and tactics that struck first. The weapon was the Type 93 torpedo. 24-inch diameter, almost 30 feet long, nearly 3 tons. A warhead of 1,080 pounds, 50% heavier than most contemporary torpedo warheads. Maximum range at 36 knots was 40,000 meters, at 48 knots, 20,000. The propulsion system ran on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, producing almost no bubble trail. A ship targeted by a long lance saw nothing approaching. The eyes were human. The Imperial Navy selected sailors with exceptional vision and trained them as masters in lookout. Training lasted months and was conducted in total darkness until the lookout could identify objects invisible to an untrained eye.
The binoculars issued to these men had lenses 21 centimeters in diameter, with light-gathering capacity that no other navy matched. These men were not support personnel. They were part of the weapons system. The tactics were built around surprise. Night torpedo attacks by heavy cruisers and destroyers in column. Searchlights activated at the last moment. Long lance salvos launched from all tubes simultaneously. Whoever sees first, fires first. Whoever fires first, hits first. For 18 months, this worked. And the proof came in the same waters where Lee would fight. On August 9, 1942, a Japanese force under Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi, 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, approached Guadalcanal from the northwest to attack the Allied screening force guarding the transport anchorage. The American and Australian ships outnumbered Mikawa's force in total displacement by more than 85%. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 9 destroyers.
These ships were newer by an average of 10 years. They carried radar, a technology that should have detected the Japanese long before any lookout could spot a ship in the dark. On paper, the outcome should have been one-sided in the Allies' favor. Mikawa's lookout spotted the Allied picket destroyer Blue at a range beyond what any radar operator on the Allied side detected. The Japanese column passed within 500 yards of the destroyer Patterson without being seen on radar. The first indication the Allied cruisers had of the attack was the sound of torpedoes entering the water.
Within 33 minutes, the heavy cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, Astoria, and HMAS Canberra were destroyed or fatally damaged. 1,077 Allied sailors died. Mikawa lost no ships, not one. The radar on the Allied ships had detected contacts. The operators were unsure what they meant. The contacts were dismissed as returns from nearby land masses, or assumed to be friendly vessels. No commander in the Allied force had developed a procedure for translating a radar contact into a firing solution. They were trained to fight with what they could see. In a night action against an enemy who fired first, they saw nothing until the torpedoes were already running. 3 months later, the lesson repeated. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, a force of 8 Japanese destroyers running supplies to Guadalcanal was intercepted by 5 American heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright. The Americans detected the Japanese on radar at a range of more than 13,000 yards. They had 7 full minutes of radar tracking before opening fire. 7 minutes in which the Japanese were visible on every American radar screen and invisible to every Japanese lookout. Wright hesitated. His flagship Minneapolis opened fire. The muzzle flashes lit up the American column.
The Japanese destroyer commanders, who had not yet seen the enemy, now had a target. They turned and launched long-lance torpedoes at the gun flashes. Minneapolis took 2 torpedoes and lost her bow. New Orleans took a torpedo that detonated her forward magazines and tore off everything forward of turret 2. Pensacola took a torpedo that flooded her engine rooms and set her oil ablaze. Northampton took 2 torpedoes and sank. 1 Japanese destroyer was lost. The Americans had radar. They detected the enemy first. They had 7 minutes of advance warning. They lost 4 heavy cruisers. Radar provided the information. The doctrine that governed how men reacted to that information could not use it. The Long Lance killed ships that saw it coming on a screen and did not know what to do with what they saw. The system worked. Japanese leadership saw no reason to change it. But Japan had the technology to build radar.
Japanese engineers at the Naval Technical Research Department had produced a cavity magnetron as early as 1937, 1 year before the British built a comparable device. The capacity existed. The priority did not. Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku, chief of the armaments section of the Navy General Staff, warned that Japan could not go to war without radar. His warning was not acted on with urgency. A crash program in radar development was finally instituted in August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. By August 1943, the Navy's Electrical Research Department had grown to just 300 staff. The reasons were structural. Technical officers in the Imperial Navy were subordinate to line officers in status, in promotion, and in influence. By November 1942, the shortage of combat personnel was severe enough that technical officers were absorbed into the regular officer corps to fill gaps in combat billets. The engineers who should have been building radar were sent to replace dead lieutenants. Inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army fragmented what research existed, with both branches running independent radar programs and neither sharing results with the other. The radar installed on the battleship Musashi, the largest warship in the world, suffered broken antenna insulators and transmitter tube failures during routine gunnery practice off Katsura Island in September 1942. Firing the ship's own guns destroyed her own radar. This sent criticism back to the Naval Technical Research Department, but criticism does not replace engineering capacity. After the war, Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo, who commanded Destroyer Squadron 2 through the Solomon Islands battles, offered his analysis of Japan's defeat. He blamed 3 factors: the failure to develop radar, a disunited naval command structure, inter-service rivalry with the Army. The admiral who ran the most successful night torpedo force in the Pacific War identified radar as the first cause of his country's loss. If you're finding this collision between Japan's night fighting doctrine and American radar worth your time, subscribing helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. By mid-November 1942, Guadalcanal was consuming the American surface fleet at a rate that could not be sustained. Since August, the Navy had lost 2 fleet carriers, Wasp and Hornet, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers in the waters around the Solomons. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships, 1 carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The attrition was crippling both sides, but America could replace losses and Japan could not. This arithmetic, however, offered no comfort to the men who had to fight the next engagement with whatever remained afloat. The Marines held Henderson Field.
Japanese troops held the jungle around it. Neither side could win without controlling the sea approaches at night. Japanese warships had been running down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands chains, to bombard the airfield and land reinforcements. American warships tried to stop them. So far, the Japanese had won nearly every night engagement. Ironbottom Sound earned its name because the seafloor beneath it was already carpeted with the hulls of ships from both navies, stacked in some places within a few hundred yards of each other, visible on modern sonar surveys as a graveyard of steel that stretches for miles. Admiral Yamamoto loaded 11 transports with the 38th Infantry Division and assembled a support force that included the rebuilt battleships Kirishima and Hiei. The plan was the same as before: shell Henderson Field at night, destroy the aircraft, land the reinforcements.
On the night of November 12th, the first attempt ended badly for both sides. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan took a dozen cruisers and destroyers into Ironbottom Sound and walked them into a Japanese bombardment force. In the chaos, American ships fired on each other in the dark. 2 admirals died on their bridges. 7 ships were sunk or sinking by dawn. The Japanese battleship Hiei took over 80 shell hits and was scuttled the following day. The Japanese were coming back to finish the job. Admiral William Halsey surveyed what he had left and found it insufficient by every measure. His cruiser force was wrecked. His destroyers were shrinking. 1 carrier remained in the Pacific, Enterprise, damaged and on her last reserves. Halsey stripped Enterprise of her escorts and sent 2 battleships and 4 destroyers into the waters he himself described as utterly unsuited to the maneuvering of capital ships, especially in darkness.
Task Force 64 was assembled in a single afternoon. 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, none of which had ever operated together. Behind them, 5,000 yards back, Washington and South Dakota, which had spent 34 hours in each other's company on a high-speed transit. This was not a battle group. This was a collection of strangers. Coming toward them was Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake, with heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, 9 destroyers, and the battlecruiser Kirishima, whose 14-inch guns had torn through American warships in these exact waters 24 hours earlier. Kirishima's magazines were loaded with Type 3 fragmentation shells designed for airfield structures. These shells killed men and wrecked superstructures. Against a battleship's armored belt, they were nearly useless. But Kondo did not expect to meet a battleship.
Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted Lee's formation, but identification of the ships ranged from cruisers and destroyers to aircraft carriers. The confusion was never resolved. Lee and Captain Glenn Davis, Washington's commanding officer, had been preparing for a night like this. Washington was the lead ship of the North Carolina class, the first American fast battleships built after the treaty restrictions expired. Laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in June 1938, launched in 40, commissioned May 41. Standard displacement 35,000 tons, full load over 44,000. Hull length 729 feet, 9 16-inch Mark VI rifles in 3 triple turrets, each capable of throwing a shell weighing 2,700 pounds to a range beyond 20 miles. 25-inch dual-purpose guns in 10 twin mounts, belt armor 12 inches thick, speed 28 knots, crew exceeding 1,800.
Before Guadalcanal, Washington had served in the Atlantic. From April through July 42, she operated with the British Home Fleet, guarding Arctic convoys against a possible sortie by the German battleship Tirpitz. The same Tirpitz that never left port when convoy PQ-17 was scattered and destroyed that July. Washington spent 3 months standing watch against a threat that never materialized, was refitted, and was sent to the Pacific, where the threat was arriving by the hour. The weapon that made her different from every other battleship in the Pacific was the SG Surface Search Radar antenna on her foremast. A microwave set operating on 10-centimeter wavelength, capable of detecting a ship-sized target at ranges beyond 15 miles in total darkness, rain, fog, or smoke. It produced a plan position indicator display, a circular screen with the ship at center and contacts as green returns around it. Bearing and range updated with every sweep.
Lee's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Hooper, fed data from the SG directly into the Mark 37 fire control computer, which computed the solution and trained the turrets. No crew member needed to see the target. The guns aimed where the radar pointed. The crew fired when the computer said fire. Lee had drilled this process until it was automatic, night after night, until his team could acquire a target on radar and deliver the first salvo in under 90 seconds. No other ship in the Pacific could match this. After dinner, when officers not on watch were ordered to the wardroom, Lee, Davis, and Hooper would spread the charts and work through firing solutions, reload times, every possible scenario for the main battery and the 5-inch guns. Radar as the primary sight, data from the screen as the only source. Eyes, useless. screen, everything. When the radar room reported contacts bearing east of Savo Island, Lee took a long drag on his Philip Morris, looked out at the black water, turned to Davis and said, "Well, stand by, Glenn. Here they come." Task Force 64 entered Ironbottom Sound in column, destroyers leading, battleships 5,000 yards behind. At 23:16, WAC opened fire on ships of the Japanese outer screen. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal began. Inside 2 minutes, a long lance found WAC. Seaman Nauman Berman recalled later that he did not understand what happened. Just an explosion and then nothing. WAC broke in half. The bow separated and stayed afloat. The stern went down in less than a minute. Surviving crewmen went into the water. A minute later, an unknown number of WAC's own depth charges detonated among the swimmers. Men who had survived the torpedo and the sinking were killed by their own ship's ordnance as it settled beneath them. Seaman James Friel jumped from the fantail and swam clear. 84 of WAC's crew did not. Preston took shells and a torpedo simultaneously. Benham lost her bow. Gwynn took hits and withdrew. In 10 minutes, the screen was gone. South Dakota passed through the burning wreckage of WAC and Preston, and the firelight caught her hull, her superstructure, all 35,000 tons of her moving against the dark water. The Japanese lookouts, the masters trained in total darkness with 21-centimeter binoculars, saw her instantly. Then her electrical system failed. Then her muzzle flashes set her own aircraft on fire. Then Atago's searchlight found her, and every Japanese gun that could bear opened up. Kirishima's 14-inch battery. Atago and Takau's 8-inch batteries. Destroyers from the flanks. Nearly 30 hits in minutes. Fires burning across 3 decks. 38 dead and 60 wounded. The Type 3 shells shattered everything above the belt, but could not penetrate the armored citadel. South Dakota turned south and ran. Nobody was looking left. Washington was on the left side of the strait, behind the burning wreckage, in total darkness. No lights. No searchlight. No muzzle flashes. The SG radar had been tracking a large contact on the starboard beam for more than 20 minutes. Lee knew what it was. Hooper had a firing solution. The turrets were trained. The shells were in the chambers. The powder charges were loaded. Everything waited on one word. Lee did not speak it. Before the battle, the gunnery officer had identified a gap in the radar antenna's coverage sector. The gap had not been repaired. South Dakota had lost communications, her radars were down, and she had last been seen somewhere to starboard before going silent. There was a real possibility that South Dakota was in the dead zone. On the line of fire,
Shooting at a large radar return that might be the other American battleship was not an option. Lee waited. The cigarette burned down between his fingers. The green return moved with the Japanese formation, steady, closing. At approximately 2 hours after midnight, the survivors of WAC, who were still in the water, heard Washington pass them in the darkness. They could hear the hull cutting through the water. Some of them shouted. Captain Davis held course. He knew what would happen if he stopped. Then the searchlight on Atago swung south and illuminated South Dakota, still burning, still retreating. Lee could see where South Dakota was. She was not where the large return was. She was not on the line of fire. Lee finished his Philip Morris, turned to Davis, and gave the order. At midnight, Washington opened fire on the battlecruiser Kirishima, the first head-to-head confrontation of battleships in the Pacific War. Range, 8,400 yards. By battleship standards, this was point blank. The first salvo straddled Kirishima, shell splashes rising on both sides, close enough for the concussion to ripple through her hull. The gun crews were already reloading. The second salvo struck Kirishima's superstructure at the level of the third bridge and obliterated everything on it. With the third salvo on its way, Washington split her 5-inch battery. 2 guns shifted to Atago, Kondo's flagship. 2 more loaded star shells and fired them above the Japanese formation, the bursts lighting Kirishima's hull from above and blinding Japanese gunners trying to locate the source of fire that was coming from the dark. The remaining 5-inch guns joined the main battery on Kirishima. South Dakota was still burning to the south, drawing every searchlight, every gun, every pair of trained eyes in the Japanese formation. Washington was firing from the left side of the Sound, exactly the position nobody had thought to look.
Japanese doctrine said, "Whoever sees first, fires first." They were looking at South Dakota. They were seeing South Dakota. They were firing at South Dakota. Washington was invisible. The doctrine had no provision for an enemy who fires accurately without showing himself. The entire principle of night combat assumed that shooting requires visual contact. A searchlight beam, a muzzle flash, a silhouette against a burning ship. Washington used none of these. She fired by radar, in the dark, without a single visible signature. A report from the Combat Information Center stated that Kirishima had sunk. Lee ordered ceasefire. For 90 seconds, Washington was silent. The Sound that had been shaking every frame, every compartment, every rivet in the hull, rolling across the water for miles, hammering against the islands on both sides of the strait, stopped. The guns stopped. The ventilators kept running. The radar kept sweeping. The green return was still there, still moving, still turning.
Kirishima had not sunk. The correction came through. Lee ordered fire resumed. Washington opened up again, every gun that could bear, 16-inch and 5-inch together, the Sound returning as if the pause had never happened. The hull vibrated from bow to stern with each salvo. Brass casings rolled across the decks in the handling rooms. Men in the turrets worked by muscle memory in heat that exceeded 120 degrees after the first 3 salvos. Nobody spoke except to call the steps of the loading cycle. In 7 minutes of firing, Washington put 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and 107 rounds of 5-inch ammunition into Kirishima. The minimum confirmed count was 9 16-inch hits. Several sources cite 20. Even the minimum means that every 5th or 6th round of main battery ammunition struck a moving target at less than 10 kilometers, in complete darkness, with no visual contact, by radar alone. The shells that inflicted the fatal damage did not look like hits. They fell short, skipped off the flat surface of the water, and punched into Kirishima's hull below the waterline. Lee watched the splashes from the bridge and counted them as misses. Those misses opened the boiler rooms. Water climbed through the hull plating and began drowning the fires that heated the steam that drove the turbines. The boilers failed, one by one. Kirishima's rudder jammed, and she began describing a slow circle to port with an increasing list to starboard. The fires that had started in her superstructure spread downward. Her crew fought the flooding and the fires through the night, trying to save a ship that was already lost. Washington was not hit once. Kondo had lost his main striking unit. His flagship was damaged. One heavy cruiser remained untouched, but somewhere in the dark was a ship he still could not find that had just destroyed Kirishima in 7 minutes. He ordered his force to a westerly course and launched a final spread of torpedoes into the darkness toward Washington's estimated position. Every torpedo missed. Lee chose not to pursue. Chasing a retreating force through these waters without a destroyer screen meant exposing Washington to torpedo attack in a confined channel. He ordered a zigzag course and withdrew, steering well to the west of the damaged American ships and the men in the water, so that any pursuing Japanese vessel would not be drawn through the survivors. At 3:25 in the morning on November 15, 1942, the fires on Kirishima went out. She rolled over and sank by the stern, the last Japanese battleship ever destroyed by another battleship's guns. The Japanese Navy did not seriously threaten Guadalcanal again. The loss of Hiei on the 12th and Kirishima on the 15th stripped the fleet of its justification for further offensive surface operations around the island. Heavy ships disappeared from Ironbottom Sound. Resupply operations continued by destroyer, the Tokyo Express runs. Drums of rice dropped offshore at night, with destroyers making high-speed dashes down the slot and turning back before dawn. This was not enough to sustain 30,000 troops in the jungle. By February 1943, the Japanese command evacuated the remaining garrison from Guadalcanal in a series of night evacuations.
The campaign that had begun in August 42 with the Marine landings was over. Japan would not take the offensive in the Pacific again. The transports carrying the 38th Infantry Division, which were supposed to land reinforcements that same night, were caught the following morning by aircraft from Henderson Field. Bombers and torpedo planes from the airfield that Kirishima was sent to destroy struck the transports at first light on November 15th. 6 transports were sunk. The remaining 4 beached themselves on the Guadalcanal shore, where Marine artillery and aircraft destroyed their cargoes. Of the 10,000 troops that had embarked, only 2,000 reached the island with their equipment. The rest came ashore with nothing but personal weapons, joining a garrison that was already starving. The chain of consequence ran in a straight line. Lee stopped Kondo. Kondo failed to shell Henderson Field. Henderson Field launched its aircraft at dawn. The aircraft destroyed the transports. The reinforcements did not arrive. The garrison could not hold. Guadalcanal fell to the Americans. One battleship, firing by radar data in total darkness, had stopped the last serious Japanese attempt to reverse the Guadalcanal campaign. 20 years of night-fighting doctrine, built on the assumption that visual contact determines the outcome of a naval engagement, collapsed in 7 minutes because one man had trained his crew to trust a screen over their own eyes.
The collapse was not gradual. After Washington, the American Navy began integrating radar into every level of surface combat. Commander R. Lee Burke, who would later become the most famous destroyer commander of the war, studied the failures at Savo and Tassafaronga and developed new tactics that used radar for initial torpedo attacks before guns were ever fired, precisely the reverse of the existing doctrine that opened with gunfire and gave away the shooting ship's position. Burke's tactics were first employed at the Battle of Vela Gulf in August 1943, where American destroyers used radar to launch a surprise torpedo attack against a Japanese supply force, sinking 3 destroyers without taking a single hit. The lookouts with the 21-centimeter binoculars never saw the torpedoes coming. Japan had the engineering talent to build radar. Japan had built a cavity magnetron in 1937 before the British. The technology existed. The institutional will to deploy it did not, because the lookouts were already winning. The success of the old system prevented the adoption of the new one. By the time the Naval Technical Research Department installed a functional radar on the cruiser Otago after her damage off Guadalcanal in November 42, it was November 1943, a full year late. The Americans had been fighting with radar-directed gunfire since the night Lee opened fire on Kirishima. USS Washington served until the end of the war. She fought at the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. She screened carriers, bombarded islands, and shot down kamikazes. Across the entire war, from her commissioning in May 1941 to the Japanese surrender in August 1945, she did not lose a single crew member to enemy action. Willis Lee was promoted to Vice Admiral in March 1944.
He commanded the fast battleship divisions supporting the carrier task forces through every major operation in the Western Pacific. He participated in every major naval engagement of the Pacific War except Midway. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 44, his battleships screened the carriers and shot down Japanese aircraft during the engagement the pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Off Leyte Gulf in October 44, he commanded the battleship line that Halsey pulled north in pursuit of the Japanese carrier decoy, missing the surface engagement at Surigao Strait. He screened carriers through 2 typhoons, covered the landings at Iwo Jima, and stood off Okinawa while kamikazes struck everything around him. Through all of this, Washington was never seriously damaged and never lost a crew member to enemy action. On August 25, 1945, 6 days before the formal Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee suffered a heart attack on board a ship in Casco Bay off the coast of Maine. He was 57 years old. His wife Mabel survived him by 4 years. They had no children. The destroyer USS Willis A. Lee was named in his honor. 5 gold medals at Antwerp for putting a bullet where he aimed. 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at 8,400 yards by radar in the dark. He spent his entire career learning to hit what he could not see with his eyes. He did not live to see the surrender of the Navy whose doctrine he had broken. If you enjoyed this one, hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next.